Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on WBA's gender benchmark and looking at performance of companies on gender equality. We are meeting at a time when the world is facing multiple crises, from ongoing conflicts to economic uncertainty. All of this are definitely affecting our lives in different ways, but also reshaping how businesses operate and make decisions. We are really pleased to have such a diverse group of stakeholders joining from business, investors, civil society, and other international organizations. And today is about one central question: are companies moving from promises to practice on gender equality, and what will it take to accelerate real change? I'll just take you through a couple of slides of overview and then hand over to my colleague Hiju to present the findings for us. And I'm glad my colleague Rohan is here to help us with the slide today. So Rohan, can we move to the first slide? WBA is a global nonprofit. We assess companies' performance on various sustainability issues. We assess 2,000 of the world's most influential companies. These 2,000 companies are headquartered in different regions of the world in more than 80 countries. These 2,000 companies cumulatively generate over $50 trillion of revenues, which is equivalent to almost half of global GDP. These companies also employ directly more than 100 million people and indirectly over 500 million people in their supply chains and value chains. So this is what we try to look at: if these 2,000 companies are really performing on gender, but also other social and in climate issues, we might be able to see where the private sector in general is moving. We can go to the next slide now. WBA assesses companies across 7 system transformation. That's the way we have been doing our research for the last almost 7 years. We are now moving to an integrated approach where we want to assess companies on their impact on people and planet. So we now have 2 programs, a people program and a planet program. And our assessments will draw on climate, nature, social, and digital agenda. So I'm Namit. I lead WBA's program on people and social impact, where we want to look at how can we collectively create an economy in which people can access decent work, living wages, participate in fair and inclusive transitions, and everyone can have their rights respected and protected across the value chains. Similarly, on the planet side, we want to assess companies whether they are operating within planetary boundaries, aligning their climate actions, nature protection, and resilience from a long-term prosperity perspective. If we can go to the next slide now. Before I hand over to Hiju to present the insights, I also wanted to locate the findings in why gender equality is important and relevant for responsible business. It is quite fundamental to responsible business as a core human rights issue. It is central to corporate accountability, looking at gender as a core issue. It is also very critical from a just transitions perspective. When climate, technological, economic transitions affect women and men differently, it often deepens existing inequality. So it is important to look at gender and that perspective from a just transitions lens as well. From a workforce resilience and productivity, it's important to have safe, inclusive, and equitable workplaces, which improves retention, performance, and long-term business value. And then from a systemic change perspective, it's really important to embed gender equality into business strategies so that it supports more inclusive and sustainable, resilient economies. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague Hiju from World Benchmarking Alliance. Hiju is the lead author of this year's gender benchmark. If you haven't already read the report, we can put a link in the chat, so please have a look at the report. And Hiju has worked with several colleagues within WBA to develop this analysis, and she'll be presenting the key findings and insights to you. So over to you, Hiju. You're still on mute.
Oops, my bad. Thanks, Named. My name is Hiju, and hi everyone. It's really the privilege to share our findings in our 2026 Gender Insight Report. First, can you go to the next slide, please? First, I'd like to start by sharing our methodology. So we are taking a holistic approach, and companies in the gender benchmark are assessed across these 6 measurement areas, as you can see on the slide here. So these measurement areas, we look beyond the commitments and really dive into the actual performance across the company's entire value chain. And for depth, we apply our full gender benchmark methodology across 6 measurement areas to 105 high risk impact companies in 2 sectors, which are apparel and food and agriculture. And here we are assessing both their own operations and supply chains. And whereas for scale, our gender assessment, which is a subset of the gender benchmark, evaluates 2,000 global companies across 5 of these measurement areas, excluding marketplace and community. And we are primarily focusing on own operations here. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, now let's look at the data and our key findings. And the next slide. So this is our first key finding, looks at workplace safety. So unfortunately, violence and harassment are still far too common in global workplace. So it's creating a major barrier to women's economic participation and leadership. If you look at the top chart, 71% of companies, meaning 7 out of 10 companies, have a policy prohibiting violence and harassment. However, looking at the second chart, when you look at the second one, when incident actually happens, only 3% of companies provide dedicated survivor-centric support, such as psychological counseling or paid time off. And without this support, truly timely rescue or recovery is very difficult. And this is a massive gap between 71% and 3%. And this shows us that simply having a policy or setting up a basic grievance channel, this does not automatically ensure that survivors are protected. So we really wanted to highlight here that the critical absence of victim recovery mechanism. And lastly, looking at the bottom chart, only 7% outline specific disciplinary actions for perpetrators, such as warnings and dismissals. While these implementation gaps are concerning, building a true remedy culture is also absolutely possible. In fact, one of the findings that really stood out to us was that companies that simply track their grievances data are 20 times more likely to provide survivor-centric support. So that was one really key finding that stood out. If we can go to the next slide. Here, I like to introduce our collective impact coalition engagement, or we also call it KIC. So we tracked the priority group of companies engaged by the KIC. So just briefly on how this priority group was selected, we strategically chose these companies because while the companies had the internal workplace policies, they were lacking requirements for the corresponding supply chains. So even though they started from a lower baseline than their peers in 2023, these companies improved 2.5 times faster following coordinated engagement with by investors and civil society. So this really clearly demonstrates that stewardship really works. And if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, moving to key finding 2, which is about unpaid care. The transition to parenthood really should not differ depending on where parents live, but what we found was that the level of support a worker receives from their employers is really heavily dependent on location. So if you take a look at the first visual, this is out of 2000 data, only 480 companies or 25% offer 14 weeks of maternity leave. However, out of those 480, only 322 provides at least 2/3 pay. And considering the group level alignment with the ILO mandate, meaning the policies applied globally, offering 14 weeks and 2/3 pay at least to all employees globally. So the number then reduces to 92 companies, and that means that like fewer than 5% meets international standards for maternity leave globally. And we can go to the next slide, please. And here we also looked at the broader care support indicators, looking at the trends since our previous assessment. So we saw positive momentum in childcare support, other family support, and flexible work hours, meaning that employees can adjust their time, adjust their work days. But however, if you look at the bottom right, we observed a slight decrease in flexible work locations. So here, following the surge in flexible work benefit during the COVID-19 pandemic, we're now seeing a decrease in this vital benefits just in a few years later. So it's important to highlight that out of 46 companies that rolled back this policy, 36 of them are headquartered in United States. We are clearly seeing this regression concentrated in a specific country. And finally, I want to emphasize that while the progress around childcare support, other family support, flexible work hour is encouraging, these benefits still cannot substitute for adequate and equal parental leave. And next slide, please. And our third finding applies gender lens to the global climate transition. So grounded in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, a just transition represents the social dimension of climate action. So it's a critical opportunity to generate equality, and we have a shared opportunity here to ensure women are actively included in the green economy. So to understand if companies are bringing women to the table, in addition to our gender data, we also assessed 1,600 real economy companies across these three areas. So first is the women are often not recognized as a stakeholder group. So if you look at the top bar here, only 7% of companies engage in their workforce on the just transition or on the social impacts of their climate transition. But when you look more closely at whether companies explicitly mention women or women workers in this dialogue, the picture becomes even weaker. So most companies treat workers as a homogeneous group, and less than 1% explicitly mention women in these engagement processes. And second is about sex disaggregated involuntary turnover data, which helps quantifying transition impacts. So overall, 23 of companies disclose involuntary turnover data. But looking at the right side, only 1% reports their involuntary reports involuntary turnover by gender. So, and it's not shown in the slides, but interestingly, 36% of companies already collect sex disaggregated data on their overall turnover. So this is not simply not it's clear that the company is simply not tracking this data. And without breaking down the involuntary data, companies cannot really see if women are losing their jobs at higher rates, or it's very making it difficult to design targeted strategy to protect them. And the third is related to jobs and skills measurement. So gender-blind approaches limit access to meaningful transition opportunities. While this is also not shown in the slides, but our broad data reveals that 26% of companies have professional development program for women, but here only 10% commits to reskilling explicitly linked to transition impacts. And only 2 companies actively promote gender equality in this program. And one of these 2 companies is Naturgy, which collaborates with social partners to enhance training, employability, and promotes gender equality in the context of just transition. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, now let's look at the overall results across our global baseline. And yeah, here, this is the company performance overall data. The average score across 2000 data is 18.9 out of 100. So it falls right into the 10 to 20 score band if you see the graph here. This is actually an encouraging increasement from the 15.6 in the previous assessment. However, if you look past the halfway mark, this dotted line here, out of 2,000 global companies, only 8 companies score above 50 points. Next slide, please. And moving on to the performance by region, looking across the regions, we also see a shifting landscape. If you look at the second bar from the top, companies headquartered in Europe and Central Asia are currently leading the global baseline. And North America, which was in the lead during our previous assessment, actually shows a slight regression today and reflecting some of the broad pushback that we see today. And broadly, we can also see that companies in North America and Latin America and Caribbean shows similar performance, averaging 19.5 and 19.3. South Asia and East Asia, the Pacific, companies also have the almost identical averages, coming in at 16.9 and 16.8. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now let's zoom into our 105 benchmark companies in apparel and food and agriculture. So apparel companies are consistently outperforming food and agriculture companies in 5 of these 6 measurement areas. If you look across the measurement area, the biggest gap between the apparel and food agriculture are founded in representation and marketplace. However, for both sectors, the highest scoring area is health and well-being, while the lowest is compensation and benefits. And this tells us while establishing basic safety protocol is becoming standard practice, but ensuring economic security really remains a sharp challenge. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And this complexity is also clearly reflected when we compare the percentage of companies that meet the elements or the MET rate in their direct operations and supply chain. As you can see from the lighter color bar on the chart, both sectors perform very similarly in their direct operations at 18%. However, if you look at the darker bar representing the supply chain, their performance diverges. Apparel performs significantly better at 24%, while food and agriculture sits at 14%. And this reflects over a decade of public scrutiny and multi-stakeholder initiatives in the apparel sector following disasters like Rana Plaza and really pushing companies to extend the policies to the factory workers. For food and agriculture, they have also the industry challenge. They're operating through highly fragmented supply chains of smallholder farmers, makes this oversight inherently more complex. And next slide, please. It's the conclusion. To conclude, our findings show that while setting policies is essentially first step, our shared opportunity now is to translate those commitments into practice. Specifically, climate transition strategies must incorporate meaningful engagement with women workers, sex disagreed involuntary turnover data, and gender responsive reskilling pathway. For investor, we invite you to continue to use your positive leverage to help companies set time-bound targets. And as companies face trade-offs in managing these pressures, investors play a critical role in ensuring gender equality that remains in the integral part of corporate strategy and practice. And for policymakers, we encourage an enabling environment that raise the baseline for all companies. And for civil society, we look forward to continuing to work together and to provide practical guidance and amplifying workers' voice. And the next, if we could briefly go to the next page, I just wanted to provide a quick preview of our website. This is a view of our gender assessment. And moving to the next slide, this is the view for the gender benchmark. And all of this data is freely available on our WBA Data Explorer. And we highly encourage you to visit the website and explore these insights. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and feel free to leave any questions in the chat. And back to you, Namit. Thank you.
Thank you, Hee-Joo, for that insightful overview. I know there was a lot of data in there. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and put your questions here. We will respond to your questions either in the chat directly at the end of this webinar, or maybe we can come back to you on email. And I think what really stands out is the gap between commitments and implementation, and that the urgency of addressing that gap is really important. We now move to our panel discussion, where we'll unpack some of these findings from the different perspectives that the panelists present today. So I invite all my panelists to switch on their cameras if you're not already on, and I'll quickly introduce my panel. I'm delighted to be joined by Moushmi Sarangi from Fairware Foundation, Harpreet Kaur from UNDP, Luda Sistounova from Amundi, Kathy Rousel from Amfori. Thank you all for joining us today. I can't see all the cameras on, but we'll get started, and hopefully you can also switch on your camera as we move along. And Moushmi, if I can start with you, and we see here that we see improvement, or at least not a lot of backtracking when it comes to commitments or promising action on gender equality. But there is still quite a bit of a gap when it comes to translating that into action, particularly in the supply chain. And you work in the apparel sector, work very closely with supply chain actors. So from your perspective, what are some of the most critical challenges and opportunities in advancing gender equality across supply chains? And maybe you can bring your expertise of looking between brands and SME suppliers. So what are those most critical challenges and opportunities from your perspective?
Thank you, Namit, and thank you also for the detailed insight into the report of World Benchmarking Alliance. I'll first draw a little bit of attention to the industry realities of the apparel sector. I'm sure all of you all know, but just to also set the context from which I will be sharing my experience throughout the next session. The apparel and textile sector has three very critical realities. One is where is the money and where is the responsibility, right? If you look at the whole power dynamics, the profit margins favor the buyer a lot more than they favor the producer. Vis-a-vis responsibility. The responsibility, because of the national legislations and the frameworks, fall a lot on the producer and less on the buyer. So that's one critical element to keep in context. Second is looking at the fragmented supply chain. Now, of course, with a lot more work around transparency, we know for some of the big buyers where they produce from, starting from the farm to the factory, but there is still a lot more ambiguity around where the supply chain is. That's one. Second, one factory produces for multiple buyers. So there is no one buyer supplier responsibility, net. One producer, a number of suppliers. So that brings in further complexities of responsibility. And the third that we have to bear in mind when we look at why things are not moving or why the needle is not shifting is a top-down pricing model. The price is determined from what the profit margin should be, and then goes, okay, how much should be paid to the supplier, thereby what should be the wage, and then the last point of attention is generally due diligence or what should be, allocated for, say, activities, interventions, trainings, etc. So these three characteristics define the sector. Okay. And now when you look at the facts, we're talking about an industry that employs, at least in the Asia specific, from where I come from, 35 million women workers. 80% of them are women. And 1 in 3 face gender-based violence. So it already establishes the fact that you take any apparel and textile supply chain, there will be gender-based violence. And that acknowledgement is necessary. This statistics we all know, but do we recognize it for our individual supply chain when I'm talking about a buyer-supplier relationship? Most say it doesn't happen in my supply chain. It's there, but it doesn't happen in mine. But if the facts say 1 in 3, it is inevitable that it is not in your supply chain. So one, I think the need for recognition that gender-based violations happen in the supply chain, how do we address it? So looking at the facts and industry realities, I think the main challenge comes from the attention that we give to grievance mechanisms not functioning. Of course, they are not functioning. They're not as efficient as we would like it to be, but we give very little attention to production practices, purchasing practices that have a major bearing on what workplace conditions are at the factory level. So not just paying attention to grievance mechanisms being functioning, but what are the enablers that will help women in the workforce to feel safe, gender equality to be a practice rather than just a policy. The second challenge is looking at the costing for human rights. Whenever we look at pricing hardly takes into inclusion the costing for human rights, which is inclusive of gender policies, actions, because when you have a workforce which is 80% women, I wouldn't look at it policies for women. If you have policies for the workforce which are implementable, it will also impact women. The costing for human rights is missing in a big way. There are a lot of activities, but they are also very much in silos, right? Not interconnected to the business practices. So these two, I think, are the most critical challenges that we have in the textile and apparel supply chain. It becomes even bigger as a challenge because the sector is largely small and medium. So that already puts suppliers at a space where there is less resources that they have and less negotiating power that they have vis-a-vis the buyer to implement structural changes, to implement structural advancement to address gender issues, including gender-based violence. But of course, all is not grim and gone. There is a lot of opportunity in the ecosystem where, drawing from a lot of voluntary guidelines, including landmark guidelines of the UN, where we are moving towards legislative framework that puts human right due diligence to the center of operations. And it's talking about having human rights due diligence based in your core business. It's not CSR. Due diligence is not CSR that, you're polluting the water. Okay, open 2 schools. Good that you open schools for education, but that does not resolve the core fundamental issues. So human rights due diligence puts a lot of onus into the management systems and processes of the buyer. That's one, a good positive development, I would say, of the legislative frameworks that's emerging, with the intent that it would work in inclusion of workers and worker voices, but it's also, a lot of other stakeholders that will have to work collectively to make the positive changes. The second, I think, is looking at the risks. How do we look at risk, not just from what is happening unfairly at the shop floor, but what are the risks, again, emerging from business practices, and how, with shared responsibility of the buyer and supplier, we engage with worker voices central to driving the design to make changes. Until now, it was a lot more finding faults of, what in the upstream the workers need to do. They need to collectivize, suppliers need to do better. Now we are talking about how each stakeholder has a legitimate voice and a legitimate role, including financial support from buyers, to ensure that these progressions are made. Because again, drawing to the industry realities where the power imbalance is huge. I am not putting suppliers out of the responsibility framework, but we do have to take into cognizance this industry reality of the huge power imbalance and fragmentation. So the new legislative frameworks do put in human rights due diligence at the center. And this is, I think, a big opportunity for not just the apparel sector, but the entire global supply chain, where shared responsibility can be the enabling pillar to ensure that the entire value chain participates rightfully and with the right voice. I'll stop here for the first question, Namit.
That's very helpful, Moushmi. And I think the concept of shared responsibility is definitely one big piece. And then purchasing practice definitely comes up even in our conversation and our assessment. That is quite a big gap. And you raised a couple of points around legislation on due diligence. I'll bring Harpreet into the conversation. And Harpreet, I mean, from UNDP, you work with all the actors, but definitely with governments. So if I can ask you, what role do governments and multilateral actors play in moving companies from commitments to implementation, like Moushmi highlighted, and particularly in the Asia region? If you can give us some perspective on how that works.
Sure. No, thanks, Namit, and thanks, Moushmi, for to kind of setting us on shared responsibility and kind of really helping us tie. Also, congratulations again on the report. I think it does capture sort of the moment very, very clearly, where there's so much happening and so much everywhere, where we see a lot of uncertainties incoming. I think largely, what I'm seeing here in Asia and what we see here in Asia in our work is that governments, but also multilateral actors are kind of playing a key role in closing the gap somehow between the commitments and the practices. still a lot more needs to be done. But I think the two key elements where I see that they have been contributing into this space is really around sort of creating both an enabling environment. So, to kind of having conversations, whether it's around awareness raising, whether it's about capacity building of different stakeholders, but also really trying to, a degree of a policy and regulatory push. And I'll give a couple of examples, in terms of how national action plans on business and human rights. In Asia now, we have 8 national action plans, and I think in some ways they're an important part of this. I'll probably give a small example from Mongolia, where gender is being integrated directly into labor protection, into workplace standards. So it's kind of started to shape how businesses actually operate and not just what they commit to, right? When governments with the National Action Plan set out expectations for businesses, this is integrated not just, into one sort of section or one sector, but just kind of, looking at kind of more holistically. I think in ASEAN, we also see, we see this reflected also in the ASEAN frameworks, including the recent right to clean, healthy environment, but also in terms of the digital economy and sort of some frameworks around that. And what we're seeing here in the ASEAN frameworks is that, we're beginning to recognize inclusion and equity as part of the economic transformation, which wasn't as clearly verbalized, at least in the, in some of the regional frameworks that we have had in the past. But again, I think the real test lies in implementation. How do you translate these frameworks, whether it's national action plans or the commitments made in the ASEAN declarations, into business practices, into supply chains, but also really into everyday reality of workers. And I think that's where some sort of a continued alignment between governments, businesses, and multilateral actors really, really become critical.
That's very helpful, Harpreet. And you mentioned about a couple of country national action plans where you have seen some of the gender and human rights actions sort of coming together. Can you go a bit deeper into some of those examples and share what you see and what you find interesting there?
Sure. I think a couple of national action plans would really, would stand out in terms of how they have integrated a gender lens into their policy frameworks. And, I've already shared the example of Mongolia, but also if you look at the Malaysia's national action plan, it really positions gender as a cross-government priority, linking it to anti-discrimination law, gender budgeting, and corporate accountability. So I think across different ministries and departments, that are leading on particular aspects, you see that happening. In Indonesia, there is actually a lot more focus on gender responsive labor inspection and addressing workplace discrimination and pay gaps, and that's particularly in high risk sectors. It specifies that. Again, I think somewhere where you sort of start looking at, some of the data that was shared earlier in terms of the workplace health and safety, and I think that's where particularly, in Indonesia, I think the NAF speaks out to that very, very strongly. But we're also seeing that, at least in the initial drafts on the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, both in Thailand and Indonesia, that gender continues to be a critical lens through which they are looking at. I think one of the interesting ones is also Nepal, because gender is being integrated into grievance mechanisms and protection of women human rights defenders, which is really critical to access to remedy. And, we see more and more, and we always say that access to remedy is probably the weakest pillar that's been implemented. To see that national action plans are integrating particularly aspects around access to remedy with the gender lens, I think really, really helps. We're also seeing increasing alignment with standards such as the ILO Convention 190, bringing issues like workplace violence and harassment more explicitly into policy framework. So you would see a couple of national action plans that have made an explicit reference to the ILO Convention 190 as well. So I think what we're seeing here in the region is that the gender move into the labor systems, into accountability mechanisms, but also supply chain, also supply chain oversight, and not just more broadly into the policy statements. What's equally important, Namit, is also to see that this is not just at the business level, this is not just at the government and the policy level, but also, to kind of look at how businesses are translating this. And I'll give you an example from Mongolia to just kind of close the loop on where we started on National Action Plan. In Mongolia, we worked directly with the mining associations to integrate gender into human rights due diligence, and it was it was kind of interesting because I think the request came from the association to help mining companies to sort of start looking at with a gender lens, because it is one of the requirements of the National Action Plan and for implementation as well. And there we work directly, with these association, of course, that is formed of mining companies, but then the work really involved around reviewing company policies, engaging workers, identifying risks around, including around workplace safety and harassment, but also tracking corrective actions. And I think that kind of led to concrete changes. We've seen, at least in some of the businesses, their adoption of a human rights policy and measures such as a childcare support being integrated into company operation. I think there are some of those examples that we have seen. And then I think those are some of the examples where we see a little bit of progress. But I guess the challenge is that the companies are still seeing that within their own operations, not so much in supply chain. And that's kind of critical in Asia because a large share of women workers are in informal, outsourced, and lower tier parts of the economy, kind of often really also beyond the corporate oversight. And I think that's where this challenge of, even where there is a progress, I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. And we do need to sort of start looking at the full chain, full value chain implementation in that sense, probably. Maybe I'll stop here, but happy to follow up.
No, that's very helpful. And it's interesting to see that, there are some good examples from the Asia region where governments are creating that enabling environment. But as you pointed out, just having a policy does not really solve the issue. So the implementation of the policy is also equally important. And I think that is also an area where the role of other actors, whether it's civil society or business associations or even investors, need to kind of come in and make sure that it is implemented. And so if I can bring in Luda into this from an investor's perspective, and Luda, if you can give us your perspective on how important is dialogue and coordinated engagement when it comes to driving real change in company practices, and particularly on some of these complex issues on social and gender. And in the insights, what Hiju presented, we have seen one example where investor and civil society action was able to push companies to take that extra step. But how important do you see is dialogue and coordinated engagement in driving this action?
Yes, thank you, Namit, and thanks for the invite to speak. I think it's incredibly important because what investors add to the dialogue with companies is the materiality angle. So we approach the question of women's inclusion, progression, and fair treatment in companies and in companies' value chains from a materiality standpoint, from a double materiality standpoint, specifically as a European investor. So you've already mentioned, obviously, the impact of companies on society and the implications for workers from a human rights and fairness and social justice perspective. But we also, as investors, need to think about the financial materiality aspect of these topics, first and foremost. So for us, women's inclusion is incredibly important because it drives macro level outcomes for economic systems, for the global economy, and for companies themselves. We know that there isn't really a perfect correlation or a quantitative study demonstrating the impact of, for example, gender diversity on company performance. But we know that at a macro level, there are GDP gain opportunities to be made if women are included as workers and entrepreneurs. And for that, and of course, as consumers, and for that, they need to be able to feel safe, to feel included, to have opportunities to engage with businesses, engage as entrepreneurs, as suppliers to firms, and as workers. So apologies for that long preamble, but I thought it was incredibly important to make. So when we speak to companies, this is how we approach it. We explain the reason for us kind of driving these questions around women's inclusion and fair treatment from that materiality angle, which we've seen really resonates with companies, especially at this time when we see a lot of regulatory headwinds around the questions of diversity, which have also translated further on into the questions of kind of social justice and women's fair treatment, unfortunately. So framing it from a financial impact standpoint is incredibly important. And we see that investor action is important, especially for companies who are maybe not the most obvious choices in terms of engagement targets, whether it be sectors, locations, or specific company names who haven't received a lot of attention from investors, but who play an important role as buyers or suppliers, for example, to major sectors, or as companies headquartered or operating in countries where there are certain gender-related risks, be it from, again, an inclusion standpoint or fair treatment standpoint. So this is where we see companies respond quite positively to investor outreach, because sometimes they haven't had that outreach. And also, if I may add, in terms of the approach and the focus on what we're trying to drive, I think there's been a lot of focus on kind of targets, recruitment, and representation. And really, as the earlier presentation of the benchmarks results has kind of driven home, it's really important to have the enabling environment and practices that focus not only specifically on women's inclusion, but also practices like fair pay for everyone, so that working parents, for example, can share the burden of childcare or care for elderly family members. Same, of course, with parental leave. And we're also seeing, for example, companies implementing emergency leave policies in environments where there isn't a lot of flexibility for parents. And of course, all of the policies around fair treatment, whether it be around violence and harassment, overall inclusion, and also more generally, good working conditions, the basics that are covered, for example, in the social benchmark, to ensure that workers in general have decent working conditions in place, which then uplift, of course, everyone, but also especially women. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Luda. And it's really important to also see that movement away from just having some of those initial commitments and target setting. How do we move companies beyond the initial commitments? So I think that's also where we want to see more and more investor and other stakeholders engaging companies on. If I can now bring Kathy, and you represent Amphoria Business Platform. So from your perspective, what key trends are you observing in how are companies approaching gender equality today? We have seen some examples of what companies are doing, which regions are performing, but from your membership base or your broader perspective, what do you observe? What's changing in companies?
Thank you, Namit, and thank you for also giving us the opportunity to reflect honestly on how far we have come on gender equality, but also about how far we still have to go. So you ask about key trends, and from our perspective as a global business platform, I would say that we observe that gender equality has clearly moved into mainstream of corporate sustainability strategies. So companies are increasingly recognizing that gender equality is not a peripheral ESG topic, but really a core indicator of resilient and well-managed supply chains. Another encouraging shift is probably the growing focus on gender disaggregated data. And this may sound basic, but it's actually foundational, because what is not measured cannot be improved. And without data, women's experience too often remain a blind spot in due diligence and risk assessment of companies. So of course, collecting data, that's only the first step. And what actually matters is what companies are doing with that data and how companies are progressively getting better at connecting the dots between multiple indicators that they are collecting. For example, indicators about workforce composition, women in managerial roles, commuting patterns, night shifts, dormitory conditions, and so on. And when companies analyze these data points together, they begin to uncover risks that maybe policies alone cannot reveal. So we have one of our, to be a bit practical here, one of our members, for example, noticed significant differences in turnover between male and female workers in certain departments at factory level. And when he looked more closely at the different data points that they had collected, they could realize that there was an underlying issue that was explaining the situation, which was linked to inadequate dormitory facilities and unsafe night shift transportation. And in that case, better data really led to better insights and some concrete improvements. So that's really should be the way forward for companies on how to use this data to drive actual change on the ground.
Thanks, Kathy. And I think definitely data is a very important and a starting point to bring about that change. And the other thing that we have at least observed, and we have worked with Amfori and others as well on collective action. So if you can give us your thoughts on what works well in terms of collective action when different stakeholders come together, different companies come together and working with other players, and where do you see some persistent gaps that need urgent attention?
Sure. Yeah, Amfori really, our mandate is really to support businesses that are operating globally to strengthen responsible practices and engage with challenges that maybe individual companies cannot solve alone. So as we know, together we are stronger. So we have Amfori BSCI Code of Conduct, and it's forming the basis of a common understanding amongst more than 50,000 business worldwide that gender equality and women empowerment is really an integral part of robust social management systems. So that's really basically making sure that everyone is speaking from the same understanding, but we also feel that it's our role to raise awareness on systemic issues. And one example is a training that we launched last year around the topic of violence and harassment in the workplace. So we've integrated the ILO Convention 190 into our BSCI Code of Conduct, but we felt it wasn't enough. And these training that we launched are available for both managers at factory level and workers. And they are, I think, the first ones under our platform that are compulsory, which means that if these trainings are not being followed, a finding will be raised by an auditor, because that's really a point of concern then that the topic is not taken seriously at factory level. That's one of the example. Raising awareness and common understanding is one of the things that we can achieve by joining forces together. Where we see major gaps is probably implementation at scale. It's not that companies lack policies. That was said before by one of the other panelists, but what really they are lacking is implementation pathways that work in real operational context. There are many places where companies are well aware of issues that women experience, like, for example, feeling unsafe, commuting at night, But yet, there is only a few places where there is a move beyond awareness to, for example, co-investing in practical solutions like shared transportation. So the gap is not completely in only in not understanding. It's really the actionable follow-through that is sometimes missing. And another persistent bottleneck is linked to managerial culture. I mean, I think that headquarters, when often they often underestimate how much gender equality is shaped by the day-to-day practices of managers on factory floors as well. And you can have very nice policy, they can be really well thought through, but they mean very little if supervisors are not trained, are not supported, and on top of it are not incentivized to change behavior. And that also comes from which was mentioned also before, partly through responsible purchasing practices indeed. But this is, to me, why gender equality often stalls, not at the level of commitment, but really at the level of factory leadership. And if we want to close the gap between promises and practice, which is, I think, more or less the title of your new report, we must really collectively focus on what truly changes gender outcomes. So implementation pathways that work in real supply chain contexts. And this is where business platforms, buyers, civil society, and workers themselves can be powerful if they join forces, because, as also it was said before, it's a shared responsibility to improve the situation here together.
No, that's very helpful, and we are swiftly running out of time. So if I can come back to each of you just in a minute, if you can try and summarize, and I start with you, Harpreet. We heard about what's happening in Asia, but how do we scale this up, and what will be your key message for policymakers and other international organizations who want to better support gender equality, particularly in the business context, in 1 minute?
Thanks, Namit. I'll try to do this in 1 minute. But really, I think to me, the key is, really recognizing women as economic actors and stop grouping them in the vulnerable groups, because when that happens, I think that's where I see the challenge. So to me, recognizing women as economic actors and thus designing system where women, design systems for where women actually work and not just where companies have the visibility. I think that's what I would say.
Thanks so much. Luda, if I can come to you next, and in the multiple transitions that companies are trying to navigate at this moment, how can investors ensure that gender equality remains a priority?
I think I will have to echo Harpreet's words here. We really need to deliver that message that women are economic actors, and without engaging 50% of the population, achieving an effective transition, not only a just transition, but an effective and productive transition, will be very challenging.
That's very helpful. And I'll also invite participants to ask your questions in chat. If we have a couple of minutes in the end, we'll try and respond to those questions. And Moushmi, if I can bring you next, if you can talk about one action that brands and suppliers can take from a shared responsibility perspective that can significantly improve outcome for women workers in supply chains.
I'll take 30 seconds each for two, quickly on that. One is, I don't need to reinstate that GVB is rooted in patriarchal gender norms and the power dynamics. So any intervention that is designed, if it does not address the issue of power, particularly in the apparel and textile supply chain, interventions would address issues, but not the systemic problems. So look at your intervention design from how it is going to change the power dynamics and thereby increase equality in the supply chain. That's one. Second, very basic, primary, talk to your supplier. Buyer, supplier need to engage, because unless they talk and are assured of trust that even if there are violations, we work together to improve. Because if 1 in every 3 women is facing gender-based violence, it's inevitable that it's not in your supply chain. So agreeing that it is there, but how do we together make improvements? So talk to your supplier. Yeah. These are my two interventions.
That's amazing. Thanks so much. And Kathy, if I can come to you next, what is that one key shift that you think companies need to make in the next 2 to 3 years so that this move from promises to practice can become a reality?
I mean, to me, since most issues happen at factory level, and sometimes despite policy commitments and process that are ultimately not being fully operationalized, I'm tempted to believe that the fastest and most powerful scaling mechanism for gender equality is probably to have more women in managerial roles. So that would be my quick fix for this. I know it's not necessarily that easy in practice, but I think from the moment women's voices are heard and factored in, because as it was said before, they are at least half of the workforce, so they should be represented adequately in a managerial position, and that will change the dynamic of the whole supply chains.
Thanks, Kathy. And we just have one question in the chat, and I know we are already out of time. And it is about, are there other ways to support? Sorry, there's another one now. So it's about the code of conduct and how can code of conduct be used to enforce gender equity? Are there other ways of supporting it? So I don't know if any of the panelists would like to respond to these questions, and apologies, we didn't have time to get more questions. So if you still have questions, put it in the chat. We'll definitely come back to you with a response, but just wanting to quickly check if any of the panelists want to respond to this question on the role of code of conduct and what other ways are there to address this issue.
Can I?
Sure, go ahead, Moushmi.
Quickly, so that Kathy, you get the next 30 seconds. Code of conducts are the first enablers, I would say, because as Fairware, we do have a code of conduct with our member brands in Europe. That's the first enabler. That is the commitment that we have from brands towards their supply chain. But that's not where it should end, because we've heard it from your own report, panelists saying that that's the starting point. How do we take it to implementation to suppliers? So definitely you need one to start the conversation and for the enabler to happen.
Kathy, you want to add to that?
Sure, and I cannot agree more with that. They are first enablers, but not necessarily the silver bullet. But still, I really see some benefits, because from the moment suppliers receive harmonized expectations from multiple buyers, they feel it's a strong signal, and they start investing into areas that need to be sorted out. Also, when women hear consistent information about their rights, they start speaking up as well. So it's really a good starting point, but it's not going to solve everything. It really needs for companies to take action on the ground.
Thank you again to all our speakers. I know Luda had to leave, but thanks everyone who joined us today for the webinar. Do send us your questions or comments, and I hope you can look at the full report, explore the report, and continue the conversation with us. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.